Hi, this is Annie from Hoop Sisters, and today we are going to be looking at or showing you how to do the Dresden 5 from the mystery quilt. And as you can see, this is what one block looks like. We're pretty much going to use, I think, just about the same fabrics. This is what the mystery quilt looks like filled in so far, and this is the center block that we'll be working on today. Here is what it would look like. It'd be very beautiful if you did this as a one block wonder and just repeated that to make a quilt or a table runner. So we are going to be doing the 9-inch size today. So what I've done so that I cut my fabric correctly is I've circled the 9-inch all the way across for all the fabric I need. And we're also going to be using the wool batting like we have with in our other videos. So here we have our battleizer in the hoop, and we have our wool batting, which we're going to be using. We have our fabric 1, our fabric 2, fabric 3 is the dots, fabric 4, and our background and backing fabric is going to be our solid yellow. And then for our quilting thread, that's the quilting thread. This is our thread A, thread B, thread C, thread D, our Vanish Light, and our embroidery bobbin thread. So let's get started with making our Dresden 5. Alright, this is our Dresden 5, and we are going to be doing step number 1, which is basically I have neutral thread in the needle only, embroidery thread in the bobbin, and the machine is going to stitch a placement stitch. I'm just using kind of a light aqua color thread. If you want, since step 2 is a water soluble thread is what's required, you can start with that if you want to. Doesn't really matter, just something to mark it so you know where to place your wool batting. And the next step is placing the wool batting. I'm going to be switching my thread out here in a second for the water soluble thread, but you're basically going to be placing your wool batting that has had the edges pressed so that they are a little flatter. Water soluble thread, the machine stitches a zigzag stitch to hold that to the battleizer. And basically this is an optional step, so if you decide you do not want to use the wool batting and you just want to do your piecing and have the battleizer for your batting, you can go ahead and do that. All you have to do is switch over to the next step, jump over to step 3 and skip this entirely. But let me change the thread and then we'll go ahead and I'll stitch my zigzag to hold my wool batting to my... Alright, I have my zigzag stitch with the water soluble thread on the edge of my wool batting. And again, if you wanted to skip right over that step, you would now be on step 3, which is placing your background fabric. Just place it evenly over this area. And again, with the water soluble thread, it's going to just stitch a basting stitch to hold that on there. Well, there's our background fabric for step 4. I have placed thread A in the needle only. We still have our embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and we're going to sew the cross stitch. For step 5, I have water soluble thread in the needle only, and we're going to be sewing a placement stitch. For step 6, we're going to continue with the water soluble thread, and we're going to place our fabric 3 right side up. We're going to make sure we have the placement stitch totally covered and approximately 1/4 of an inch over onto that side so that we have our seam allowance. Just do a quick peek underneath, and then we can go ahead and sew the tack down stitch. Alright, here is our fabric, our first piece of fabric all stitched down. I'm going to trim it probably about 1/8 of an inch right there. We have our 1/4 inch here already because of where we placed it, so we're good there. Also on the bottom, we're going to trim that so it's about 1/4 of an inch away from the stitching. And then I'm going to switch to my mini hoop scissors, and right here we are going to trim it close to stitching because it's going to have a satin cover stitch that will complete that. and also this little area here. I'm also going to cut close to stitching. So for step 7, I have already placed my fabric, how about my thread bee is already in the needle, and it's going to do some stitching in this area. Okay, so our step 7 is finished, and it's just some pretty shading that with the stitching that's in there, I think it gives a little bit of interest to the design. And then for step 8, we're going to add our fabric 1. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to begin to do our stitching and flipping to fill in this area, and then we'll start at the top and do the same thing going that direction. So we're going to lay our fabric 1 right side down, raw edges even with that, and I still have my thread bee in the needle, so we're going to go ahead and use that to sew the seam. Alright, for step 9, you're going to take your fabric and flip it right side up and do some finger pressing, and you can leave the same neutral thread in there and sew the tack down stitch. And now it's time to trim. Bring the hoop forward along this curved area. Of course, that's going to be finished with a satin cover stitch, so we're going to go ahead and use our Hoop Scissors Mini to trim right up to the stitching. And then along here over on the right hand side, we're going to trim that about about 1/8 of an inch. And since this is going to be a seam here with another piece of fabric added, we're going to trim that a 1/4 inch, scant 1/4 inch. There we go. And now step 10, grab my fabric 2, which is this fun stripe, and we're going to lay it right side down, raw edges even. I'm going to keep in consideration to have the selvage still on here. So I'm going to want it down a little further in that direction. But again, same thread, right side down, raw edges even, and it's going to stitch another seam. Okay, now we're going to flip this fabric right side up. We're going to finger press. And one of the things we need to do right here is we need to change back to water-soluble thread. Because this tack down stitch will be on the edge of the block, you're going to want to use water soluble, and that way when you sew your blocks together, if the tack down happens to be peeking through the seam, it will not be a big deal because you will have used water soluble thread. If you decide to not use water soluble thread and they're showing, then you might have to be picking some stitches out. That's why we like to use our water soluble. And now trimming, we're going to trim right up to the stitching on the curved edge, just like we did the last piece of fabric. We're going to do about 1/8 of an inch, a little tiny spot right there. And since we're on the edge of the block, we're going to leave about 1/2 an inch there. So be a little bit more generous than you would if you were stitching a seam there. And I'm going to change my thread back. Just put some neutral thread. I'm going to use my thread bee, whatever seems to work best with your fabric and thread choices. And I'm changing this because we're going to do a seam next. And we're back to fabric 1, and we're stitching the seam, so we're going to lay fabric 1 right side down with those raw edges even. and we're going to stitch a seam. And then we're going to flip the fabric right side up for step 13. We're still going to continue to use the same thread, and we're going to stitch a tack down. I just like to make sure the fabric stays nice and smooth ahead of where the stitching is going to be. Okay, so now I can trim my block. And again, I'm going to trim about 1/8 of an inch here, 1/4 of an inch here, since that will be a seam, and close to the stitching up in this area. Okay, I have my fabric trimmed up, and I have thread B in the needle only, and still embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and I'm going to stitch some stitching here very similar to this. For step 15, we're going to take our fabric 3 and lay it right side down, raw edges even, and sew the seam. And now for step 16, I'm going to flip the fabric right side up and finger press it and sew a tack down. And so trimming will be the same as we've done all along. Just for review, we're going to do about 1/8 of an inch in this little section here, since we have another seam that will be there. Will be 1/4 of an inch here, and right up close to the stitching on the curved edge at the top. Okay, step 17 is our fabric 1, right sides down, raw edges even, and we're going to stitch a seam. And now we're going to do the tack down stitch. However, for step 18, you'll want to use your water soluble thread because it is the edge of the block. Okay, we have our tack down stitch done, and we're going to leave about 1/2 an inch of the fabric on the right side of the block, and again about 1/8 of an inch at the bottom, and then close to the stitching on the top curved edge. For step 19, I have thread A in the needle only, and we're going to sew a decorative stitch along the top curved edges. Alright, step 20, we have thread C in the needle only, and we're going to sew a satin stitch. For step 21, we have our water-soluble thread in the needle only, and we're going to place our fabric 4 right here in this corner. Okay, for trimming on this piece of fabric, we're going to trim right up close to the stitching on those two angled sections inside the block. Outside the block, we're going to leave at least 1/2 an inch on the outside. Step 22 is thread D in the needle only, and it's going to sew a satin cover stitch. It's looking good. I like that buttery yellow background on here. Next thing we're going to do, step 23, is we're going to put our backing fabric on the back of the hoop, and you can spray the back of your backing fabric a little bit of KK2000 if you want to, and then you're just going to center it on the block, and you're going to peek under there to make sure that we've done got our backing on there. We're going to put it on the machine. And I like to peek under there to make sure that there's no fabric has flipped over. And then we're going to sew a basting stitch using water-soluble thread. Okay, I have my backing fabric on now. So as with all our blocks, anytime we have our backing fabric on, you're going to have to remember that your needle thread and your bobbin thread from here on out need to match. Another thing to remember is if your machine has an automatic thread cutting feature, you need to turn that feature off at this time. And before you begin sewing, which we're getting ready to do step 24, which is some quilting, anytime after the back is on, you always need to bring the bobbin thread to the top before you begin sewing. So let's start our quilting for step 24. For step 25, which is our last step in this block, is we have our quilting thread and the needle and the bobbin, and we're going to make sure we bring our bobbin thread to the top, and then we're going to stitch our quilting. So this is our Dresden 5 all finished, and if you're making the doilies and Dresden's quilt, then you're going to be making 4 of these, and these will be put in the center of the quilt. Because it's going to be in the center of the quilt, you're going to be trimming all 4 sides using the Trimmer by George. So here's our Trimmer by George with our crimped edge, and what you do is you just take that crimped edge, snug it right up there to the basting stitch between the battleizer and the fabric on the front, and you just make sure you don't have any fabric poking out over here. And then with the 60mm rotary cutter, you're going to go ahead and cut that, and using that metal as a straight edge. So let me do that on all 4 sides. I think I said this before, but I'll say it again. I love these fabric colors. They're very pretty. And since this is being filmed in late winter, early spring, maybe that's why I like them, because I can't wait for spring to get here. Alright, so then once you have all the different sides all trimmed using the Trimmer by George, then I have the trimmer flipped upside down or flipped over the other way, where I can use my acrylic ruler. And then I'm going to trim the fabric on the front 1/4 inch from the basting stitch. And we'll do that on all 4 sides. So that's how you trim it using the Trimmer by George.